Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are going to be taking a look at the AI Cup being held on chess.com. Now, today there was a big match in the winners bracket between Maxime Vachier-Lagrave from France, also known as MVL, and Magnus Carlsen, the former 5-time world champion. Now, this is a very, very big tournament for Maxime because he has a chance to continue his resurgence. He started his resurgence in the Speed Chess Championship, but now in the Chess Champions Tour, if he can go wire to wire and win this event, he will qualify for the grand finals being held in Toronto at the beginning of December. So let's jump right into the action. Now, the first two games of this match were relatively calm. I would say they were drawn. Maxime had some chances in game two, and then it started going the other way towards Magnus, but nonetheless, the first two games were drawn. Now, as always, the format remains the same. The players play 4 games of 15 minutes with a 3-second increment, and if the match is tied after 4 games, they will play an Armageddon game. So in game number 3, Magnus with the white pieces opens with the move e4. Maxime plays c5. We get knight to f3, and now we have the move d6. Now, of course, Maxime does normally play the Najdorf, but in game 1 of the match, he actually chose to play knight c6, and after bishop b5, g6, the players played a Ross-Lemo variation. So in this game, game number 3, Maxime returns to his favorite Najdorf. We get d6, d4, takes, knight f6, knight to c3, and now the move a6 is played here by Maxime. Now, of course, this is a Najdorf, same as game 2, by the way, when the colors were reversed. Here, Magnus plays bishop e3, we get knight g4, bishop c1, knight to f6, and now f3 played here by Magnus. Of course, he does not want to play bishop e3, knight g4, and simply make a draw. So now Magnus plays f3 here with the idea of playing bishop e3, and there's no longer a knight g4 idea, and here we get the move e6. Now in the previous game, game number 2, Magnus actually played this e5 system with bishop e6, bishop e3, knight bd7, g4, knight b6, g5, knight d7, queen d2, and h6. But in this game with the colors reversed, MVL plays e6, which is a system that he's played on and off for many years. In fact, he did play this against me all the way back in 2009 in San Sebastian when we played an invitational tournament. So now we get bishop e3, b5, queen to d2, knight bd7 played here, g4, and now this move b4 is played. Now, I've actually had a lot of experience in this variation with both colors over many, many years. In the early 2000s, I actually played the system with both white and black. It was very topical at the time. Garry Kasparov was fashioning it with the black pieces. There were many different interesting lines. One of those lines was h6, h4, bishop b7, castle, something like queen c7, bishop h3, and then there's this line with g5, I believe it was, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe I have the wrong position. But there were lines where black basically sacrificed the pawn and goes something like b4 and d5. So there are a lot of interesting lines with h6 and g5. There are also lines like bishop to b7, castles, b4, knight a4, queen a5, b3, and knight to c5 as well. And after a3 takes queen c7, and b takes a4, there's d5, e5, knight d7. Now, one tidbit that I told during my live stream while I was covering this is that this line was very popular back in the early 2000s. There was a very famous game between Vesel and Topalov, and I believe it was I think it was Vesel and Topalov and Garry Kasparov in this line. I believe in that game there were actually these two moves thrown in here. And after f4, knight b6, I forget what Topalov played. I think he played something like bishop f2 if I have it wrong. But when I was playing online at this time, I played a very famous game on the Internet Chess Club back at the dawn of the era of Internet chess. And I don't know who I was playing against, whether it was Alexander Morozevich or Garry Kasparov himself, but I played a game online with the black pieces, which continue with rook to h3 here. I took this pawn at a4 trying to even out the material, and I got soundly spanked after this great move c4 was played. Actually, at the time, this was considered good for white. Now I guess a5, the computer thinks black is better, but I took on c4. We had queen c2 hitting the knight to b6. Now here, knight takes e6 was played, pawn takes, bishop takes knight, queen b6, queen g6 check was played. King cannot run to the d file here, so I played king e7, and after f5, f6 threatening checkmate is unstoppable. I did play bishop d5, but after Moro or Kasparov sacked the rook with rook takes bishop, I had to resign the game, because if I take the rook, you lose the queen on b6, and if you don't take the rook, if you play queen b4, there's just f6, takes, e takes f6, and it's simply checkmate because the king has no squares available. Now, this game that I'm referring to was played, I believe, in the year 2000 or maybe even 1999, ages and ages ago. So in this game, however, we get b4 from Maxime, knight to a4 is played, h6 castles, and knight to e5 played here. Now this line was first fashioned by Veselin Topalov in the mid 2000s. He actually won a very nice game against the former world champion Vladimir Kramnik in something like 15 or 16 moves. I don't actually have that game handy right now, but it was one of the early games where Kramnik had started shifting to 1e4, and he lost very, very badly. Now, of course, all these lines are very well known. So here we get b3 from Magnus, guarding the knight on a4, creating a square for the knight, and down the road white might want to go f4, h4, or even something like bishop e2. Additionally, the pawn on b4 is hanging. Now if you were to take on b4 right away after bishop d7, it gets a little bit tricky here because the knight is sort of under attack. There's always d5 opening this other diagonal, and your pawns in the center are also very, very weak here, so it's a tricky position to play. So Magnus goes b3 here. The pawn on b4 still under attack. You can reroute the knight. Additionally, bishop d7 does not threaten to win the knight on a4. So we get bishop d7. Magnus plays knight b2. We got this move d5. Bishop to f4 is played here, and now we have this move knight takes f3 being played by Maxime Vachier-Lagrave. Now this move is a very, very complex move here. Maxime is sacrificing a piece, and I guess the eval bar stopped working, so let me refresh the page very quickly. And let's get back here. I didn't mean to spoil or anything, but let's see if the bar is going to start working. So we get this position after d5 is played, and now Magnus plays move bishop f4, and we get knight takes f3. Now I do apologize, it appears with the chess.com engine it's simply not working, so the eval bar simply should be ignored completely. So after d5, bishop to f4 is played here. We have this move knight takes f3, sacrificing the knight. Now black can play a move like knight g6 here, but after e5, the knight on f6 is being harassed, and if you play a move like queen c7, white has knight to d3, guarding the pawn and the bishop at the same time, and you have to retreat with the knight. And after bishop g3, white has ideas like f4 f5, maybe h4 h5 as well, and black is simply lacking in development on the king side. So we get knight takes f3 from Maxime. Knight f3 is played, knight e4, queen d4, and now this move rook g8 is played. Now I do believe that f6 is still considered theory here. Magnus actually mentioned this move in his post-game press conference. I think it's something like knight to a4 back to stop bishop c5, takes, bishop c5, white sacks the queen, and after takes, and knight d2, it's very, very unclear what is going on here. Black has all these weaknesses, the pawns on a6 and e4. White also has the bishop and a knight for a rook, but black has a rook and two pawns, so it's very, very imbalanced. Computer seems to think white is better, but it's very, very murky. So instead, MVL plays rook to g8. Now we get the move knight to e5 here. Bishop c5 is played, and now Magnus sacks the queen with queen takes e4. Pretty much the only move, by the way, because if you play queen d3, there are moves like knight f2, creating the family fork of the queen and the two rooks, or even queen to a5, threatening to take on a2 and go for queen a1 checkmate. And after a move like king b1, for example, there's knight c3 check, forking the king and the rook and the pawn, and it's simply a very dire situation. So we get queen takes e4, Magnus sacks the queen, MVL takes the queen, we get knight takes d7, and here MVL plays the move queen d7. Now the computer actually liked rook d7 a little bit more here, and after queen f6, rook takes f7, there's a move like bishop e3, and apparently white is completely winning here after bishop takes, queen takes, and rook f2, where white has two bishops and a knight for the queen, and black's pawns are not really all that well placed, and white, most importantly, has a very, very safe king here on the b1 square in the near future. So we get knight takes d7, MVL takes. We get this whole exchange here on d7. Now I think after knight d7 there might have been something better for black, something like queen to a5, or maybe there's something like bishop e7, not 100% sure, but at any rate we get this exchange. Knight c4 played here, and now MVL plays g5, and the dust is somewhat settled here where MVL has a rook and two pawns for a bishop and a knight. That being said, MVL needs to start pushing p in the center of the board very, very fast, or it could turn very quickly. So we get bishop e5, king to e7 is played here, and now we have the move h4, a great move by Magnus trying to open up the king side. MVL plays rook d8, we got the pawn trade on g5, and now rook takes is played. Now h takes g5 is maybe a move here, but after bishop g2, the problem for black is this pawn on e4 is very weak. Now if black could play something like f5, f4, and start steamrolling up the board with these two pawns, he would have great chances to win. But here, if you were to play f5 guarding the pawn on e4, now there's rook to h7, king to e8, rook to h6, very important move, undermining the base of the chain on e6. If you go king e7, bishop f6 wins the rook, and if you go king f7, I swap, check, take the pawn, and now you'll lose e4 and the game. And last but not least, if you play the move king to d7 here, white can now play a quiet move like c3, b takes c3, and now after bishop takes c3, white is going to go knight e5, and again, you're really struggling to keep this chain of pawns intact here, and black is probably losing. So MVL takes with the rook here. Magnus plays bishop e2, a good move, guarding the pawn on g4 and threatening to capture the pawn on h6. Here MVL plays rook g6, we get the move bishop to f4, and now we have bishop d4 being played. Now bishop d4 is the move to maybe support e5, maybe bishop c3 as well to support the pawn on b4. It's also an anchor for trying to push the e-pawn down the board. Magnus plays knight to e5, an excellent move here, forcing MVL to trade the bishop for the knight. Now you really don't want to trade the bishop for the knight here, but you have to, because if you move the rook away, there's knight c6, forking the king, the rook, and the bishop. So we get bishop takes knight, bishop takes bishop, and now, as we can tell, white has the bishop pair, but black's pawns still are struggling to go down the board. So Maxime plays f5, and Magnus trades on f5 and goes bishop f4, blockading these two pawns on the dark squares and trying to capture the pawn on h6. Now at this point, it's already looking like it's going to be a very clean victory for Magnus, so MVL is going to need a little bit of luck. So he plays a5 here, simply getting rid of the weak pawn on a6. We have bishop takes h6 being played, and now the move rook g2. Now what MVL correctly realizes about this position is that the pawn on h6 doesn't matter. The only chance black has to survive the game is to get these pawns rolling. You got to start pushing Pete. So we have rook g2, bishop f1, rook to g6, bishop e3, king f6 is played here. Maxime trying to get the king to the center to support this f4 pawn thrust. So now Magnus goes bishop c4, we have king to e5, and now this move rook h7 is played. Now rook h7 in and of itself is not necessarily a blunder, but it does allow Maxime to start angling for counterplay, because after f4 is played, on first glance it looks like rook to h5 check is simply going to win the pawn on f4. Now at this point, after f4 was played, Magnus actually started shaking his head a little bit in the live feed of the cameras, and it was clear that he thought rook h5 was simply winning on the spot. Now the computer actually says rook e7 is winning here, because if black goes king f6, you have rook f7 check with the classic right triangle, and white is simply winning after bishop takes f4. Everything is guarding each other, and white wins the game. So black should play king to d6, attacking the rook while attacking the bishop at the same time. But after this nice move rook to a7 here, now if you take the bishop, I have rook a6 check, winning the rook on g6. And if you play a move like rook to g4 supporting the pawn, now there's bishop to b6, rook to c8 here, and after bishop takes a5, white is simply winning with the two b's here and all of these queenside pawns pushing up the board. Instead, Magnus plays rook h5, which is much more human. We get king f6, and now a very critical move, bishop b6. If Magnus were to play bishop takes f4, which is the obvious human move, after rook g1 check, king b2, and rook d to d1, suddenly white is getting checkmated on the back rank here, and there's really no way to stop it. If you play a move like a4, for example, there's rook b1, king a2, check, king b2, and rook g to b1, which is checkmate because the king has no squares available. Additionally, if you play bishop e5 check, I go king g6, attacking the rook, and there's still the threat of rook to b1 checkmate as well. So the only other way to try and stop it is to go c3. So if check, you can go to c2 and you cover the c1 square. But now after c3, there's rook g2, and you get laddered here, because after you block, I take, you block, I take, and the king simply has no squares available once again. So Magnus plays bishop b6, and now MVL plays rook d7. We get bishop takes a5, rook g1, king b2, f3, and now bishop takes b4. And what Magnus correctly realizes here is that he expects to be able to sack one of the bishops for the two pawns and then have a bishop and three pawns to win with. So the game continues with f2. We get bishop c3 check, king to g6, and now rook to e5. An excellent move here, realizing that if black queens the pawn, you sack the bishop for the pawn, and after rook takes e4 with a rook, bishop, and three pawns, specifically three connected here versus the two rooks, it's a very routine win. So Maxime plays rook to e1, guarding the pawn on e4. We get rook to e6, king to g5, rook f6, which is a mistake, by the way. I believe here the winning move is bishop to a5. And now the point is that after e3, you can go bishop b6. And again, black is going to have to sacrifice the two pawns for either this light square bishop or for this dark square bishop. Instead, Magnus goes rook to f6, allowing e3, and now it starts getting very spicy because now both these pawns are extremely close to queening. So Magnus plays rook f8, and here MVL blunders inexplicably with this move rook d c7, or rook c7 I should say. In this position, if MVL had played rook d to d1 trying to promote the f-pawn to a queen, the game probably would have ended in a draw, because the best that white has is something like a4, queen takes, rook e8. But now after king f4, even though you have a rook, bishop, and the three connected, black still has this pawn that's two squares away from queening. And after a5, rook to h1, a6, and something like rook to a1, black should be able to save the game. Instead, MVL plays rook c7, and now Magnus is able to play bishop d4, getting the bishop on this diagonal, and the game is effectively over. Now, this is why bishop to a5 was such a strong move, because it would have gone for the same plan, but one move earlier. But nonetheless, of course, after Maxime's blunder, Magnus does not miss it. MVL decides to take the bishop on c4 here out of desperation, because here there's really nothing you can do. If you promote, I just take the pawn and I'm guarding it with the bishop and the rook. If you play king g4, I simply sack the bishop for the pawn. You take, and after rook f2, once again, I have a rook, bishop, and 3 pawns versus the 2 rooks. And in particular, with this king cut off where it can't ever get back towards the queen side, it should be a very basic win. So Maxime sacks the rook with rook takes c4. We get bishop takes e3 check, rook takes e3, and after b takes c4, MVL resigns the game here, because when you play rook to e2 guarding the pawn at f2, white can play this move king c3, king g4, king to d3, and suddenly the rook is under attack. You cannot keep it guarding the pawn, and when you move it away, you lose this pawn. White has 3 pawns and the king is cut off. Very, very basic winning position. So MVL resigns this game after b takes c4. Really a heartbreak to lose the 3rd game, and he now goes down 2-1 in the match. So now let's jump to the 4th game of the match. MVL with the white pieces, must-win situation here. Is he up to the task? So MVL plays e4, Magnus goes c5, we get knight to f3, e6 is played, d4, takes, knight f6, knight c3, knight c6. Now this has been played very recently by Magnus. I believe in one of my recent recaps of Magnus's win in the Speed Chess Championship against Gucci Reza Firouzja, also known as Ali Reza, he played this line with the black pieces. Now this can be very shaky, but Magnus is continuing to experiment and play various Sicilians across the horn. So we get e5, knight d5, knight e4, bishop b7, and now MVL plays this move knight to d6. Now this is a line that was very popular, I want to say, in the early 2000s, played a lot in many games. I feel like Garry Kasparov faced it quite a few times. These days it's not as common, simply because black is making some serious positional concessions. You have these very weak d6, or not d6 squares, these very weak dark squares, and additionally white can get the bishop pair very easily, so it feels like it's one-way traffic and much easier for white to play. So MVL plays knight d6, we get the trade, and now c5 played, opening up the scope for the light square bishop on the long diagonal. c4 is played, we get knight to b4, a3, knight c6, bishop to e3 played here, attacking the pawn on c5, and now queen f6 is played by Magnus to attack the pawn on b2. Here we get queen d2, and Magnus plays rook to b8, a rather mysterious move here, playing rook to b8, because you feel like you're going to attack the pawn on b2, but after bishop takes c5, there's no obvious threat. Now up to this point, Magnus was playing pretty much instantly, but after bishop takes c5, he thought for nearly 2 minutes before playing bishop a8. Now this is one of the very difficult things in chess, which is generally you prepare a lot of variations, but sometimes they're obvious looking moves that the computer does not recommend because they're simply bad. And in such cases, if you prepare a variation, you miss an obvious move like bishop takes c5, sometimes it's not easy over the board to figure out what the best move is. And in this case, Magnus goes wrong with bishop a8. The correct move here is bishop to a6, putting pressure on the pawn on b2. And the reason this is so good is after bishop to b4, blocking the attacks on the pawn on b2, black is queen to e5 check, bishop to e2, actually sorry, not queen e5, knight d4 first. White goes bishop c3, attacking the knight, or pinning the knight I should say, and after queen e5, bishop to e2 is played. Black can trade everything off on e2 and then take this pawn on c4 with check. Now in the game, Magnus uses time, plays bishop a8, MVL plays bishop b4, we get queen to e5 check being played, and now bishop e2 is played here. And now we notice the difference. After knight to d4, for example, white goes bishop c3, and when you trade everything on e2, suddenly the pawn on c4 is not under attack. And this is the exact reason that bishop to a6 was better than going bishop to a8. And that's why you have to be very, very careful sometimes when you do preparation with computers, because somehow the move that's correct is not always the easiest one to figure out. Now bishop a8 feels more natural as well to human, just to keep the bishop on this long diagonal, because it feels like something will probably happen on this diagonal more likely than on the other light square diagonal. So at any rate, we got this position after bishop e2. Magnus decides to play knight takes b4 here, which is a mistake. After knight to d4, bishop c3, probably the best that black has is to trade everything down, play something like rook to b3 here, and after say f3 castles. White is better, he has an extra pawn. That being said here, white struggles to push the pawns up the board, because after say rook c1, black can go rook c8, king d3, and bishop b7. Pawn on d6 a little bit weak, bishop a6 also an issue, and it's just not easy to guard these two pawns on d6 and c4. So Magnus plays knight takes b4. Instead, we get pawn takes knight, bishop g2, and here MVL blunders with rook a5. Now, this position is completely winning for white after the move rook to g1, although without a computer, it's not obvious why. Now, there are two reasons. The most obvious human approach would be bishop to f3 and rook to g5 here, and it looks like on first glance after the trade in rook b4, if white were to play rook takes a7, black can take on b2. I guess after king e3 rook b8, this is still winning with rook g7, but the reason it loses instantly is because here after rook b4, there's this very nasty move rook to b5. Black cannot take the pawn on c4 because suddenly your king gets checkmated here by the rook and the pawn. And if you trade the rooks and then try to castle after rook a7, rook b8, and b6, if you take the pawn, we have the classic ice skater checkmate. King has no squares. And if black plays say h6, you go b7, king h7, king d3, and you just run this king up the board to b6. And after takes rook a8, king cannot get back to c7, and white wins the rook and the game. Instead, or actually the second part is after rook g1, the other move is queen takes h2, attacking the rook. But after castles, black is lost here because if you were to castle, there's queen g5, threatening the bishop, but also threatening checkmate. If you move the bishop, gg, why not? And if you don't move the bishop, you play say h6. I just trade the queens, and now I have an extra bishop on the board. And additionally, after queen h2 castles, if you were to play a move like g6, for example, now queen g5 also wins because you're attacking the bishop, and if the bishop moves, queen e7 would be checkmate. Instead, MVL plays rook a5. Now keep in mind, none of these moves are necessarily easy to find. We get queen to e4, rook to g1, and now after bishop f3, the ideas don't exist in the same way here because now the queen is on e4, threatening queen b1. Nonetheless, MVL is very, very resourceful, and he finds a way to keep the game going with rook takes g7. We now get bishop e2, queen e2, queen to b1 check, queen d1, queen takes b2, and it looks like in this position Magnus is okay. Even though the king can't castle, pawn on b4 is weak, rook is under attack, white's king a little bit open here as well, but MVL finds the only way to keep the game going by swinging the rook over from a5 to g5, double stacking on the file, and trying to go rook g8 with checkmate. Game continues with queen b4, king f1, queen takes c4, king g1, and now Magnus plays rook f8. Now it looks like the dust is settled. Rook g8 is no longer a mate threat here, because after queen e4 you have rook to b1 on the next turn, and so you think that black should be doing fine. But here MVL finds the only move, which is to sack the rook with rook takes f7, and Magnus has to find queen e4, another only move, or else black loses. If you were to take the rook with your rook, there's rook g8 check, rook f8, queen h5 check, king d8, and then rook takes rook would be checkmate. The king on d8 is simply stuck. And additionally, if you were to take with the king, for example, then white can go queen h5 check, king f6, queen h6 check, king f7, queen g7, king e8, and queen e7 would be gg, why not? So in this position, Magnus finds queen e4. The only move, black threatens to go rook b1, either winning the queen or checkmating the king on g1, since there are no squares available. Here MVL finds rook g to g7, another great move to keep the game going, and now Magnus plays this move, rook takes f7. Now looking back on this game in retrospect, Magnus probably should have played this move queen c6. It's a very, very tough move to find, because after rook e7, king d8 in this position, white can go rook ef7, but after king e8, there's simply no way for white to do anything. If you were to check and take on h7, now black can go rook b5. There's this threat with rook g5 here, and even if you take on d7 with the king and the two rooks, and the fact that these pawns are super split, white should have no winning chances. Instead, Magnus plays rook takes f7, which is also completely understandable. And last but not least, just to point out one more thing, if black were to play rook b1 trying to win the queen, this would lose to rook check, king d8 takes. If you go back to e8, rook e7 is checkmate. And after king c8, rook c7, let's just say you go king b8, white can play rook c1, breaking this pin of the queen. And now with the passed pawn, the great rook on g7, and the weak black king on b8, white should be winning. So here we get rook f7 instead, rook g8, rook f8 is played, queen h5, queen g6, only move. If you move the king, once again, it would be checkmate with rook takes rook. So we get queen g6, rook takes queen, pawn takes, queen takes, and now Magnus makes a slight mistake with this move, king to d8. Now, again, this position is still probably completely fine, but rook to f7 would have more or less drawn on the spot. Now, this is a very scary move to play because it looks really, really dangerous after, say, checking queen g7, but black can always just keep going rook f7 and rook f8, and white has no way to make any major progress. And additionally, if you aren't careful, say in a position like this, you go check and then h4 trying to push the pawn. After king f8, black's threatening rook g7. If you move the king, I can simply play a move like rook to b2, hitting the pawn at f2, and the rooks are super active, and white has no chances to win the game. Instead, Magnus plays king d8, and we start to take a ride on the wild side. We get queen g5 check, king c8 only move. If you go back to e8, queen e7 is made again. So we get king c8, queen c5, king b7. If you go to d8, queen c7 wins the rook and the game. So we get king b7, check, king c8, check, king b7, check, king a6, and now queen takes d7. And now it's very unclear what's going on. White has a queen and 3 pawns. More importantly, you've got the wide peepos here on the d and the h file, and the king is off to the side on a6. Now Magnus finds rook fd8, which is the best move. We get queen e6, king b6, another excellent move by Magnus, intending to start pushing this a pawn down the board immediately. Here Maxime plays queen e7, which is a mistake in this position. Perhaps you should go f4, because after say king c6, for example, I think there's d7, king c7, and h4, and white is really pushing these pawns up the board quickly, while black has not even started to push his a pawn. Again, this might be a draw with perfect play, but it's very tricky to play. Instead, MVL plays queen e7, and now Magnus goes a5. We get queen c7, king b5, and here MVL finds a very inspired plan with king to f1. Now it looks like you're too slow here, because black is 1, 2, 3, 4 moves away from queen to the pawn. Your king is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 away, so surely it's not enough. But what MVL realizes here is that he can't push these pawns. These pawns are way too slow relative to the black a pawn rolling down the board. Additionally, here it can get very scary, because after say black has this pawn to a4, you can even go rook to a8 here, and the rooks are connected between a8 and d8. Rook is also behind the passed pawn, and white will have to force a draw immediately, or black will get a queen and win the game. So what MVL realizes here is that the pawns can't do anything, so he tries to bring his king towards the center before black can get a queen and win the game. So we get a4, king e2, a3, king d3 played, and now Magnus blunders with rook a8. Now I suspect at this point Magnus probably thought it's a draw no matter what when he goes rook a8, because he figured, well, rook is behind the passed pawn, I'm just going a2, a1 and winning the game. But now it gets very tricky after this move king d4. The correct way to draw this game was to play rook d to c8, attacking the queen. And if white goes queen a7, now you have rook a8, queen b7, and you go king c5 here. King is heading towards the center of the board, and after d7, rook d8, again, the rooks guard each other, and it's behind this passed pawn that's going down the board immediately, so white will have to force a draw. But when rook a8 is played here, MVL finds king d4, and now Magnus simply misunderstands the position, or maybe he just thought it's still a very easy draw, and he blunders away the game with this move a2. Now the reason this move is so bad is now after queen b7, the king does not get to come towards the center of the board. The king is getting pushed towards the edge of the board. So we get king to a4, queen b2 played by Maxime here, a very, very good move, stopping the pawn from queening. Now the king is cut off, and now even though the rook is behind the pawn, you can't magically reset. What you'd love to do is somehow put the king like this with the king behind the rook so you can push the pawn here, but in this position the king cannot somehow hide behind this rook on a8, so now you're just going to lose the pawn on a2 for nothing. Now here Magnus blunders with rook takes d6. He probably should have promoted to a queen, but after takes, king b5 and something like queen c3, rook d6, and king e5, white has excellent chances to win because of black king can be checked very easily by this queen on c3. Additionally, white has 2 pawns to push up the board. And so just in general, I think in a practical human game, white should win this most of the time. Magnus here plays rook takes d6, simply overlooking this move king c5 here. And after king c5, Magnus has absolutely nothing that he can do to stop himself from losing the rook on d6 or checkmate on b4 or a2. So after king c5, there's really no way to stop the mate. If you go a1 queen, I take and just take your rook on a8, and this is an easy one with a queen and 2 versus rook, much easier than with a lone queen against a rook, like in the match between Nepo and Magnus from yesterday. Actually, I guess if you queen, you don't even take. You actually, sorry, if you were to make a queen here, there's queen before mate in one. And if you move the rook anywhere, there are no good squares. c6 and d5, the king captures. If you go anywhere else, it should be winning. If you play rook c8, I just take the rook, and your pawn on a2 is still going to fall on the next move. And so Magnus plays rook b6 here, attacking the queen on b2, and MVL plays queen takes a2 checkmate. Now what Magnus was hoping for was something like queen b6 here, hoping for queen and mate. But if you play queen b6, I can throw in the check with rook c8 first, and after king d6, rook c1, black probably still has some chances to save the game. In fact, computer thinks this should be a draw. Additionally, if you play king takes rook, spaghetti, there's rook b8 checking the king and winning the queen, and it's GG, why not? So MVL plays queen takes a2 checkmate. King has no squares available. The white king covers 2 squares, and the queen on a2 covers a 3rd square, and that's game over. So MVL wins a really, really nice 4th game, a very puzzle or study like ending here. He finds his way to win this game and tie the match at 2. Now, unfortunately for Maxime, he would go on to draw the Armageddon game. He was actually underbid significantly. Magnus bid 8 minutes and 28 seconds to MVL's 10 minutes and 16 seconds. What that meant is MVL started the game with 15 minutes to Magnus's 8 minutes and 28 seconds. Magnus was able to hold the draw with the black pieces. MVL had to win the match, and so with that draw, even though the match ends tied 2.5, Magnus does win the match because of the Armageddon game, and with that, he is the winner of the winners bracket in the Chess Champions Tour AI Cup. What that means is that MVL is at least guaranteed to finish top 3. He will play the winner of the losers bracket. Now, whoever wins between Maxime and Anish and Nepo tomorrow will have to face Magnus on Friday, and they will be in a situation where they have to win 2 matches to win the tournament. Now, beating Magnus once is a big task, let alone winning twice, so it's going to be a very, very difficult uphill battle for whomever Magnus faces, but it should be exciting nonetheless. So on that note, I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap of the finals of the winners bracket in the AI Cup being held on chess.com. Make sure to smash that subscribe button below if you haven't already, and I'll be back very soon with another great recap from the Chess Champions Tour being held on chess.com. Have a great one, you guys. See you soon. Bye.